The afternoon light cuts at a sharp angle through the blinds of the maid's quarters, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. His hands are large, manicured, a subtle gold wedding band on his ring finger. Henry rummages through the drawer with jerky, almost violent movements. Worn t-shirts, rolled-up socks, a faded bra. Everything is tossed aside without mercy, as if he were hunting for evidence at a crime scene. His fingers brush against the fabric lining at the back of the drawer. There's something there, something that shouldn't be. The diary is small, bound in brown leather that has long lost its sheen. He extracts it with the cold precision one might use to pull a shard of glass from a wound. He opens it to the first available page. The handwriting is feminine, careful. The capital letters slightly larger than necessary. The mark of someone who learned to write later in life, or who practices their penmanship with devout dedication. Today he asked me for the third time if I had a boyfriend. Fear stops me from telling the truth. He can never know that this child is his only heir. Henry's face undergoes a transformation. The suspicion that had been gnawing at him for weeks, that irritating itch of something being off that he couldn't quite name, crystallizes in an instant. The diary slips from his hand. He remains standing motionless, while the page turns on its own, caught in a draft from a door someone left open in another room. His only heir. 2 weeks earlier. Martha is 34, but the mirror in the public restroom near Henry's estate reflects a woman who looks 10 years older. Her hair, always pulled back in a tight bun, has begun to gray at the temples. The white apron she wears for work can no longer be fastened completely at the waist. Her belly protrudes like a secret she is desperately trying to swallow. She has worked at Henry's estate for 7 years. 7 years of waking up at 5 a.m., of cleaning rooms he never enters, of cooking meals he eats alone while reading the Wall Street Journal. 7 years of making herself invisible, as a good maid should be. But now no one could fail to notice. Henry summoned her to his study on a Tuesday morning. The room smells of polished mahogany, expensive leather, and old money. Light streams in through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured grounds, and he sits behind a desk that seems endless, like a judge behind a bench. "Sit down, Martha." She perches on the edge of the chair, hands resting protectively over her stomach. Henry doesn't look at her immediately. He shuffles some papers on his desk, that well-known tactic of men who wish to intimidate. When he finally looks up, there is something like disdain in his eyes, a coldness that makes Martha swallow hard. "How long have you worked for me?" 7 years, sir." 7 years. And in 7 years you've been acceptable, discreet, never caused trouble. He pauses. A deliberate pause, the kind that precedes something cruel. "But lately you haven't been very discreet about your personal activities, have you?" Martha feels the heat rise up her neck. He's looking at her stomach now, and it's not a look of curiosity. It's a look of judgment. "I don't understand, sir." "You don't understand?" Henry leans back in his Herman Miller chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "Martha, you show up here pregnant having never mentioned a boyfriend. Never brought anyone to the house. You eat here, sleep in the servants' quarters, use my water, my electricity, my roof. And now you're bringing a child into this house from a man nobody knows." Tears begin to well in Martha's eyes, but she holds them back. She learned years ago that crying in front of him only makes him angrier. "The situation is embarrassing, Martha. Do you understand? My position in society, my circle, people are starting to ask questions. And what do I tell them? That my maid is running a motel for her flings out of my house? Sir, Let me finish." His voice is low, but every word hits like a gavel. "You are creating a problem for me, a liability, and now you're slowing down. Yesterday you left early for an appointment. You left the house dirty. That is not acceptable." Martha opens her mouth, closes it, tries again. "Mr. Sterling, I need this job, please. I can keep up. I'll work until the end of the pregnancy, I promise. You're going to fix this. It isn't a question, it's a sentence. You have 1 week. I want an explanation that makes sense. Who is the father? Why aren't you married? What do you plan to do? And most importantly, how will this stop affecting your performance here? Henry returns to his papers, as if she has already been dismissed. Martha stands up. Her legs are shaking. She walks toward the heavy oak door, eyes downcast, breath caught in her throat. As she passes the massive bookshelves that cover an entire wall of the study, her belly brushes against one of them. It's a movement imperceptible to a normal person. But the objects standing there are arranged precariously, as they always are in the homes of very rich men who believe gravity works differently for their possessions. A silver frame falls. Inside, a photograph. Henry younger, maybe 28, standing next to a younger boy with features strikingly similar to his own. They are on a yacht, drinking champagne, laughing at something the camera didn't catch. Marta picks up the frame. The glass has cracked in a diagonal line like a scar. She looks at the photograph. Then she looks at Henry, who is still behind his desk. His face doesn't change, but there's something in his eyes. A microscopic shift in focus. He saw the accident. He saw how she looked at that photo. And in that second, something clicks perfectly in his mind. She is hiding something, and he is determined to find out what. Henry doesn't sleep well that night. He stays up until 3 in the morning, sitting in the armchair of his master suite, a glass of scotch in hand. He reads the scene over in his mind like a script. His only heir. He has no children. Never wanted them. His ex-wife, Marion, God rest her soul, could never conceive. 12 years of marriage and nothing. And now this. The next morning, he makes a call. The private investigator Henry hires is a gray man, the kind who vanishes in a crowd. His name is Rick. He has an office in a nondescript building downtown, and he is expensive. Very expensive. But Henry doesn't blink at the price. He slides across a manila envelope filled with cash and a photograph of Martha, taken from a distance through a telephoto lens on a morning she went grocery shopping. "I want to know everything," Henry says. "Where she came from, who her family is, who she's sleeping with, everything." Rick simply nods. He's done this dozens of times. While Rick begins his work, visiting courthouses, talking to neighbors, tracing the digital footprint of a life, Henry starts his own investigation, and he is far less subtle. Martha returns from the market on a Tuesday afternoon. She clutches 2 heavy paper bags against her chest, trying not to strain her back. When she enters her room, a space so small it barely fits a twin bed, a wardrobe, and a chair, she realizes immediately that something is wrong. The bed is made, but not the way she left it. The mattress has been slightly shifted. Her clothes, which she had folded meticulously on the second shelf of the wardrobe, have been rummaged through. The drawer where she kept her documents was opened, and although the papers are there, the order is wrong. Her heart begins to hammer in her chest. She checks for the diary. It's gone, completely vanished. Correction, she checks for the diary. It is still there, hidden deep, but she checks her other hiding spot. Martha sits on the bed and feels panic seize her body. Her hands tremble as she holds her belly. The baby moves. He always moves when she gets scared, as if sensing her fear through her skin. Over the next few days, the surveillance intensifies. Henry starts doing inspections of her room. He knocks on the door mid-morning when she's cleaning the kitchen and enters with some flimsy pretext. Need to check if the windows are sealed properly. Or the handyman needs to check the wiring in here. But Martha knows. She knows he's hunting. She doesn't eat properly for a week. At breakfast, she pushes the food around with her fork but can't swallow. Henry notices this too. He says nothing, but there is a cold satisfaction in his eyes when he sees her crumbling. On the 8th day after the conversation in the study, Martha makes a desperate decision. She takes a sonogram picture, the one the doctor at the community clinic gave her 2 weeks ago. It's a grainy, grayscale image showing the silhouette of a baby. She stares at that image for a long time that night, in the brief moments she has to herself. Then, in the morning, she puts the sonogram in a plain envelope and leaves it on Henry's desk in the study. It is an act of desperation. an attempt to appeal to something she isn't sure exists inside him. Humanity. Maybe if he saw this, he would understand that this isn't just an embarrassing situation. It is a life that will be born in a few months. When Henry returns from lunch and sees the sonogram on his desk, his first reaction is pure rage. He summons her to the study again. This time, his voice is different. It isn't cold anymore. It is pure poison. What is this? He holds the sonogram between two fingers as if it were evidence of a felony. Sir, This is emotional manipulation. It is exactly the kind of thing a person does when they are terrified of being exposed. He tosses the image onto the desk. Do you believe this will make me forget my rights? That I will simply accept a child being raised under my roof, consuming my resources, without knowing who the father is? The father is... Martha starts, but her voice is so weak it's barely audible. Silence. I am going to make one thing very clear to you, Martha. I've been consulting with my attorneys. If I discover you are involved in anything illicit, fraud, theft, anything, I will sue for damages. I will have this child taken from you in family court. Do you understand? Martha feels the floor disappear beneath her feet. Now, you have 48 hours. You will come here, into this room, and you will tell me exactly who the father of this child is, or you and your son will have to find another place to live. Martha leaves the office. She can't breathe properly. Her fingertips are tingling. She locks herself in the service bathroom and weeps. Out of fear, out of fury, out of despair. Meanwhile, that night, Rick the detective delivers his report. It is a thin document, barely 3 pages, because there is very little to report. Rick has photos of Martha coming and going, to the market, the clinic, Sunday Mass at a small Catholic church in the neighborhood. But as for her past, it is as if she didn't exist. There's a gap, Rick says, pointing to a paragraph. Until 2015, there are no records of her in any database I could access. No social security number active prior to that date. No school enrollments. It's like she popped out of thin air. And before 2015, Henry asks, there are references to a place called Oak Creek. It's a tiny town in the Rust Belt, about 200 miles from here. I managed to dig that up through an aunt of hers who still lives there, but beyond that the trail goes cold. Henry pulls the envelope with the remaining cash from his pocket and places it on the table. Thank you. You can go. That night, Henry looks at a map. Oak Creek is a microscopic dot, almost invisible. And there, in that forgotten town, lies the answer. He feels it. It's like a hunter catching the scent of prey on the wind. He grabs his car keys and decides he will go personally. No one uncovers secrets better than a man who has all the time and money in the world to look. The prenatal clinic is a 40-minute drive from Henry's estate. It's a simple place. Walls painted a pale blue that is supposed to calm expectant mothers. Martha has been there for 2 hours, waiting her turn. She clutches her appointment card, a card she pays for herself because Henry never offered insurance, never asked how the pregnancy was going, never asked anything. The doctor examines her with professionalism. The baby is fine. Blood pressure is a little high, due to stress, he says, as if stress were something trivial, something solved with ginger tea. She receives a slip for the next appointment and leaves. Meanwhile, Henry is in his study. He has a meeting scheduled with his lawyers at 3 p.m., but it is only 1:45 p.m. He knows because he checks compulsively that Martha left the house at 11:01 a.m. The appointment lasts 2 hours. She won't be back before 2:30, maybe 3 eyes. He has plenty of time. He descends the grand staircase of the mansion. His footsteps on the carpet leave marks, the kind of detail a man like Henry never notices because there is always someone to vacuum them away later. He opens the door to the maid's room. The space is so small he could extend his arms and almost touch both side walls at once. The bed is modest. The wardrobe is antique. There is a towel hanging on a nail, just one towel for the whole week. And that smell, the smell of a cramped life, of a person occupying the minimum amount of space possible in the world. Henry begins to tear it apart. The wardrobe is wrenched open. The clothes are removed shelf by shelf. He is looking for documents, for names, for anything that explains that absence of records before 2015. Under the bed, there is an old suitcase. Inside, baby clothes. Too small to be for a current child. Clothes for a baby who has already grown. Clothes that belong to someone from the past. His heart beats faster. He continues searching. He pulls at the wood backing of the wardrobe. There is a space behind it, between the furniture and the wall, and there, wrapped in a cloth, is the diary. But Henry doesn't find it immediately. First, he finds a letter with a notary's seal dated 2010. His name is on it, written in faded blue ink. His full name, Henry Arthur Sterling. His hands go cold. Across town, Martha is on the bus back. The bus window is dirty, coated in road grime. She looks out, watching the city pass by. Colonial mansions, strip malls, a pharmacy sign advertising a discount from 10 years ago. Her phone doesn't ring. It never rings. Who would call her? But there is something in the air, a sensation, that feeling mothers get, that urgency that comes from the gut, not the mind. Something is wrong. She gets off the bus 2 stops early. She starts to walk faster. The swelling in her feet protests with every step, but she ignores it. When she arrives at the mansion, the front door is unlatched. Just a crack, just enough. Martha feels panic spike in her throat. She enters. The house is silent. Too silent. She heads toward her room, hands trembling. And there, standing in the doorway of the service quarters, is Henry. He doesn't see her immediately. His back is turned, reading something. Her clothes are all on the floor. Her private things are exposed like roadkill. And he keeps reading, absolutely absorbed, as if he were alone in the world. "Get out," Martha says. Her voice is weak at first, but it grows. "Get out of my room. Now." Henry turns. His face is a mask of cold discomfort, as if he had stumbled upon an insect. He doesn't answer. He just looks at her with those gray eyes that seem never to blink. "This is invasion of privacy," Martha screams. Tears begin to stream down her face, not of sadness, but of pure fury. "This is mine. This is all I have. How dare you?" She tries to approach, tries to snatch the paper from his hand. It is an almost animalistic movement, the ferocious protection of someone who sees their life being overturned, exposed, desecrated. Henry pushes her away. Not with violence. He doesn't raise a hand to strike her. He simply moves her aside, with the same firmness one moves a piece of furniture. It is almost more humiliating than a blow. "You want to know my right?" He speaks for the first time. "My right is that of the owner. This house is mine. Everything in this house is mine. You are my employee, and as long as you are under my roof consuming my food and my air, I have every right to know who you really are." "Please," Martha pleads. "Please, sir, I can explain. Just give me time." Henry doesn't answer. He literally puts her out of the room, not with brutality, but with the absolute certainty of someone who has never been questioned. He closes the door and locks it. Martha pounds on the wood with her fists. "Mr. Sterling, sir, please. It's not like that. You don't understand." But there is only silence on the other side of the door. Inside the room, Henry returns to the diary. He opens it to the marked page. "Today he asked me for the 3rd time if I had a boyfriend. Fear stops me from telling the truth. He can never know that this child is his only heir." He flips frantically. Page after page. Names that mean nothing to him. Dates, descriptions of days. And then, on a page where someone tried to glue something that had fallen out, there is a photograph. The photograph is old, very old, faded by time and light. But the quality is sufficient for him to see clearly. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, is holding 2 children. A girl who can't be more than 5, and a boy who is clutching her skirt with an intensity only small children can express. The boy has gray eyes, the same gray eyes Henry sees every time he looks in the mirror. Henry lets the diary fall from his hands. His breath stops. On the other side of the door, Martha keeps banging. Her voice sounds increasingly distant, as if coming from another world. And Henry stands there, frozen, holding the photograph with trembling fingers. Who is this woman? How does she have a photo of his mother? How does she have a photo of him, of a boy Henry, of a Henry who doesn't know why he is in a diary belonging to a maid he barely knows? And that girl. Who is that girl? The answer is there, on that page of the diary. But Henry doesn't want to read it yet, because reading would mean knowing, and knowing would mean that everything, his entire life, his absolute certainty about who he is a lie. The pages of the diary are yellowed with time. Some have watermarks, spilled coffee, maybe tears. The handwriting changes throughout the entries. At the beginning it is careful, almost polite. Then it becomes looser, more urgent. In the last few months of writing, there are words crossed out with such force the paper is nearly torn. Henry reads, "Mrs. Sterling was diagnosed today. Cancer. She asked me not to tell Mr. Henry Sr. Said he already had too many problems with the business. She was always like that, thinking of others before herself. Mrs. Sterling, his mother, Catherine. The name shocks him. He didn't call her anything, really. Just mother, when necessary. When he had time." He continues reading. "Luke visits her whenever he can. He makes her laugh with those silly drawings of his. Henry almost never comes. When he comes, he stands there talking about money, about stocks, about things Catherine can't follow. Luke, his younger brother." Henry pulls the photo from the page and looks at it again. That small boy, clutching the skirt of a woman Henry suddenly recognizes, but a recognition that comes with guilt. That was his mother. Young, before she aged rapidly, before she became that silent ghost inhabiting the hallways of the house. He reads on, "Luke slept here yesterday. He can't go back home anymore. His father caught him kissing a boy in the club gardens. Said it's a perversion." Henry agreed with him. My God, how Henry agreed. As if his brother were a problem to be solved instead of a person. The floor seems to tilt beneath Henry. I love him. I need to write this somewhere because I can't say it out loud. I love Luke with an intensity that hurts. And he loves me too. He said he wants to run away with me. That he wants a normal life far from this house, far from these people who hate him for being who he is. The words begin to blur as Henry reads. His hands are sweating. Catherine died today. Without knowing I'm pregnant. Without knowing Luke is the father. She left believing that kind boy she loved so much had simply vanished from our lives. He was there, waiting outside the hospital. When I told him about her death, he fell. Literally fell to his knees, and I held him while he wept. A later entry, with handwriting much more erratic, almost illegible. Luke didn't wake up. The car hit the tree. The police said it was an accident, that he was driving too fast. But I know what it was. It was despair. It was the weight of an entire life on the shoulders of a boy who was made only of love. I am 6 months pregnant. I am alone. I am terrified. And then, a more recent entry. She is here. My daughter. She has Luke's eyes and Catherine's eyes. She is all the beauty left of two people Henry discarded like trash. I named her Sophie because she is wise, too wise for a child, because she was born into a world that hates people like her father. When she grows up, Henry can never know. He might want to take her from me. Or worse, he might accept her, but only if she bows before him, only if she denies who her father was. I won't allow that. This child is free. This child is Luke's legacy. And I will protect her with my life. Henry falls to his knees on the floor. Martha's room, so small, so cramped, seems to shrink even further around him. He clutches the photograph against his chest. That picture of his mother holding that boy he simply forgot. Or rather, that boy he chose to forget because it was easier to agree with his father than to defend him. His breath comes in spasms. On the other side of the door, Martha's crying has stopped. Now there is only silence. That silence that follows despair when a person finally gives up on being heard. Martha. Henry's voice is unrecognizable. It doesn't come from a place of control or certainty. It comes from a place he didn't know existed inside him. "Martha, open the door." There is no answer. "Please." He puts his hand on the knob. It was locked, but it is unlocked now. He opens it slowly. Martha is sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, hands around her belly. Her face is swollen from crying. When she sees him, her entire body tenses, like an animal expecting a blow. "It's me," Henry says, but the words mean nothing. He isn't him, or rather, he is, finally, someone he has never been before. He sits on the floor too, a few feet from her. He places the photograph between them, that old photo of his mother, of his brother, of a life he chose to destroy because it was more convenient than defending it. "I knew her," he says. His voice is so low Martha has to lean in to hear. "I knew my brother, Luke. Not very well. I had other priorities. Business, money, the family image. All the things that now seem so empty I can't even see them." Martha says nothing. She just watches him, waiting. "I agreed with my father. Did you know? When he found out about Luke. I was there and I simply agreed, as if it were a deal being closed, as if my brother were an asset that needed to be liquidated to avoid a loss of value." Henry looks at the photograph, at that boy holding his mother's skirt with such intensity, as if his mother were the only good thing he knew. "You loved him," Henry says. It isn't a question. "With all my soul," Martha replies. And those 5 words carry a lifetime. Years of secrecy, of grief, of the courage to carry a child alone in the world. "And Sophie." Henry stops. The child has a name, a child who is his niece, a child who is all that is left of his brother, a child whose existence he almost destroyed in his blind fury to know, without wanting to understand. "Sophie is all he left behind," Martha says. "It's all Mrs. Sterling left behind. It is the only place where they still exist." Henry rests his forehead against his hands, and he weeps, not like a man controlling his body, but like someone whose life has just exploded in his fingers. On the other side of the thin wall of the room, no one can hear him. On the other side of the city, no one knows what is happening. And in Martha's belly, Sophie moves, as if sensing that something has changed, as if all the anger hanging over that house suddenly transformed into something different, into remorse, into truth, into a chance, fragile as a silk thread, for reconstruction. And it is revolting to see someone judged and humiliated for protecting the life of someone they love, isn't it? If you also believe that true justice comes not just from uncovering secrets, but from recognizing courage in others, hit that like button now to support Martha and Sophie. Henry remains on the floor of the maid's room for a long time. Not minutes, hours. The sun entering through the small window moves slowly, shifting shadows across the room while he sits there, immobile, like a man who has just discovered the house he lived in all his life was built on sand. Martha doesn't leave. She remains leaning against the wall, watching him. There is no anger in her gaze now, only exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has carried a secret so heavy for so long she can't remember what it's like to live without it. When night falls, Henry finally moves. He picks up the diary with both hands, as if it were something precious that might break, and extends it to Martha. His fingers tremble. "This belongs to you," he says. His voice is so hoarse it barely comes out. Martha takes the diary. Her fingers brush against his for a brief second. In that touch, there is everything that wasn't said during all these months. Fear, hope, the fragility of two people who are finally on the same page. "I want to show you something," Henry says later. He leads her through the house, not through the main hallways where the staff passes. He takes a side route, one Martha knows because it's where she takes out the trash. He climbs a service staircase, and then, in a corridor he rarely enters, he opens a door. His mother's room is exactly as it was the day she died. No one has entered since. The bed has not been unmade. The curtains are drawn, letting the dust do its silent work. There is an embroidery hoop hanging on the wall, something she started and never finished because death does not wait for people to finish their projects. Martha covers her mouth with her hand. "I don't come here," Henry says. He isn't apologizing. He is just stating a fact, a failure so large and so obvious it needs to be named. "I don't come here because it's easier not to, because coming here would mean acknowledging she is gone, and that I wasted so much time with her." He sits on the bed. Dust rises around him in a small cloud. "Luke came all the time, did you know? He drew her. I saw some of those sketches years later. He captured her, not how she was physically, but how she was. Her kindness, her fatigue, her love." Henry runs his hand over the mattress where his mother slept. "When my father kicked him out, she simply shrank, like a plant without water, and I did nothing. I signed the paperwork protecting the estate. I agreed it was best for the family. I chose the money over my brother." Martha sits beside him, not too close, but close enough. "He loved her very much," she says, referring to Luke. "I know. I read it on every page of your diary." There is a silence that isn't uncomfortable. It is a silence two people share when they are finally telling the truth. "I can't bring him back," Henry says. "I can't bring my mother back. I can't undo any of the things I did, or failed to do." He turns to Martha. "But I can recognize that Sophie, that Catherine," he pauses, testing the new name on his tongue, "is who she is, and that you are who you are, and that neither of you needs to hide anymore." In the weeks that follow, Henry takes actions most people would never expect from a man like him. He invites Martha for coffee in the living room, not the kitchen, not a servant's room, in the room with the oil paintings on the walls and Persian rugs on the floor. "I want to make a proposal," he says. "You are not my maid anymore. You are someone who protected my brother when I abandoned him. Someone who raised my niece when she could have simply given up." Martha watches him, cautious. "I want you to stay, but not as a maid, as part of this house, as part of this family, on your terms." "My terms?" Martha asks, as if the word were strange in her mouth. "How much do you want to earn? What space do you need? What education does Catherine need? What future do you dream of for her?" Martha takes a deep breath. No one has ever asked her for her terms before. A few months later, Henry sits down with his lawyers. He rewrites his will, a document that had remained virtually untouched for 20 years. When he finishes, Catherine, his niece, is the heir, but not in a way that leaves her unprotected. The assets will be in a trust managed by Martha until Catherine reaches adulthood. Henry also establishes other things, a foundation in Luke's name, the artist, to support young creative minds rejected by their families. It isn't a perfect reparation. None of this is, but it is a start. In the workshop annexed to the mansion, there is a scene no one expects to see. Henry is working with wood. He works slowly, with dedication, cutting pieces, adjusting angles. He is building a crib. It isn't a luxury crib. It is simple, made with the kind of detail that comes from someone who genuinely cares. There are small drawings carved into the sides, flowers, birds, a crescent moon, things Luke would have drawn. Martha watches him from outside the door, the baby in her arms, her eyes slightly closed as the infant tries to understand the world. "You know," Henry says without looking up from his work, "Luke made things with his hands too. He drew. I should have learned to do the same." "You are learning now," Martha replies. Henry stops and looks at them, at Martha, standing in the threshold, and at the baby, small and defenseless in her arms. "I'm sorry it took so long," he says. Martha doesn't answer with an easy smile. She doesn't forgive easily. She has lived too much to allow a moment of remorse to erase years of humiliation. But there is something in her eyes that has changed. An opening. A possibility. "You are here now," she says finally. "That is what matters." Months pass. The baby grows. Henry finishes the crib. Martha opens it in the room that is now hers, a full suite, not a service room. The crib receives the child as a gift from someone who finally understood that love isn't something you offer only when it is convenient. It is something you build, piece by piece, with your own hands. In the last entry of the diary, the handwriting is different. More sure, more hopeful. It is the handwriting of someone who is no longer writing in secret. Today he called her by the name we chose, Catherine, the same as his mother. Maybe some mistakes can be fixed, one gesture at a time. Luke would be proud. Mrs. Sterling too. And I can finally breathe. Martha places the diary on the nightstand of her new room. She looks at Catherine sleeping in the crib Henry built with his hands. That small face, those tiny fingers. This is the legacy Luke left. This is how the truth won. Not with dramatic legal gestures or public declarations, but with recognition, with presence, with a man who finally looked at everything he had done and not done, and decided to be different. This story teaches us that the truth, hidden for however long, is more powerful than any secret, and that redemption doesn't come from denying who we were, but from recognizing who we needed to be. If you like emotional stories like this, stories that make us reflect on the person we want to be, subscribe to the channel to join our family. Because here, we believe every man deserves a second chance, and every woman deserves to be heard.